everyone, welcome to our Tuesday Live at 5 sew along. So today we are going to work on block number 11. So I wanted to kind of back up and review a couple of things. I stuck the twisted pinwheel on the wall behind me. You can barely see those pale blue pieces that kind of form the shadows. At least I can barely see it on my screen. It may show up better on your screen. But that is formed with the high and low technique and the sidekick technique. I did want to talk just a little bit about your V-block tool before we start on tonight's block. And I've got it here in my needle area. So let me switch cameras so you can see what I'm talking about. The V-block unit looks like this. It's got the V that's formed with the seams of your unit. And you can make 11 different sizes. So this one happens to be a 4-inch finished unit, but I could do this in a 1-inch finished unit all the way up to a 6-inch finished unit. So I'm not stuck with a 12-inch block, but all of the blocks we're making for our sew along are 12-inch blocks. So of course you can change sizes to whatever you want it to be. But I wanted to remind you and show you that I do mark my tool just for ease of finding the lines I'm going to use a lot. So when I use the V-block tool, let me twist it around so you can see, you're going to be cutting your pieces from this angled side. And notice I have marked, highlighted in blue, my center triangle trim line. I have marked on the other side. First of all, I put side triangle trim number 2 because I'm going to trim the first side triangle and then I switch it around. I've also marked my line, and you can probably barely see it. It's kind of a yellow-orange color. That is my sizing line. So when I put my V-block unit on here, this one actually has already been trimmed, but I'm going to put that line on the right seam. So that just makes it easier to find the lines I'm going to be using a lot. And you can mark on your tools. Let me tell you how I did it. I always have a whole bunch of colors of Sharpie markers. So pick the color you like. And I have done it a couple of different ways. One way I've done it is make the mark. You want to do it on the back side of your ruler. I made the mark. Then I put Scotch tape over that mark to help keep it on there. Because what I find happens after a while, my mark starts disappearing and I have to remark it all the time. So you can either mark the tool and cover it up with Scotch tape so that you can still see through it, or you can put your Scotch tape on first, mark on the Scotch tape. And that way, if for whatever reason you want the marks to not be on there, you just peel off the tape and then you can replace it at any point. This little note I wrote to myself, the side triangle trim line, number 2, I actually wrote on the front of the ruler so my words wouldn't be a mirrored image. And I wrote on the ruler, put the tape over the top of it so it'll stay there. Because I have actually darkened my marks several times just to make sure that it was all there so I could see it. So that is the V-block tool. Now I wanted you to notice tonight's tool that is our corner beam tool, and I'm going to stack them on top of each other. Let me back up just a little bit so you can see. Notice they are the same shape. The general shape of the whole tool is the same shape. The lines are different and the purpose of what you cut are different, and you can see lots of colored lines on there the way I've got it. But our corner beam tool, I've marked several lines. One of them is this, the center beam trim line. I've got the blue mark. I've got to put some eyes on. I can't see that close up. I can see from a distance. That's my center beam trim number 1 line. And then my side triangle trim number 1 line. I could have gone ahead and put a mark on that, but I tend not to have a problem finding that bold solid line. But they both have notes on here for you, the center beam trim number 1 and the side triangle trim number 1. Then on this funny line here, it says center beam trim number 2, and I've marked it with red. I've also marked these lines here, the side line placement, side triangle trim number 2, the seam line placement, and there's a little bold mark down here at the bottom. And I did not highlight it, but it is fairly prominent, so I can see it easily. That makes it easy to find the part that I need to find. So the unit you'll be making with your corner beam tool is this beam across from corner to corner on your unit, and you have 11 size options. So this one's a 6-inch finished unit. I don't make them that big often, but for this block, that was just the best way to do it. And I'll show you a couple of other things as we go along. So one more thing I wanted to point out, whatever size you want, your information for what size to cut to get started is there on this angled side. So if I'm making a 4-inch unit, for instance, this was a 4-inch unit of my V block, I would add an inch to that size, and that's the size I cut my strips. So I cut 5-inch strips to make these. If the size of corner beam unit I want is 4 inches, I also cut 5-inch strips and 5-inch squares. That'll make more sense in a minute. But I'm making 6-inch finished units. That's the biggest one I can make, and it tells me down on the bottom of my tool to cut my strips and squares 7 inches. That's because for this center beam, I'm always going to cut a square. For my side triangles, I'm going to cut a strip, just like I did when I was making my V-block unit. And I want you to notice this side triangle on the corner beam unit is the same shape as the side triangle on the V-block unit. Now, they're different sizes, of course, but if I was making 4-inch corner beam units, I would cut this triangle basically the same way as I cut the triangle for the V-block unit. But because there are different guidelines that you need to line up with for trimming, it's on 2 different tools, because that would just be so visually overwhelming to put all of the lines of both tools on one piece of plastic. So I'm going to go to the overhead camera and show you how I go about getting the pieces I need for this. So here's our block for today, and I've got my 4 units ready, and I've got my plate with my pieces here to show you how I did that. So I need 2 squares for my blue corner beam and 2 squares for my red corner beam. Now, when you put this together, you can actually point all of your corner beams out. You can point all of them in, or you can put 2 in and 2 out. And this is how the searchlight block is listed in the instructions that you download from Studio 180 Design. But no matter which way you put them, you're going to start with 5-inch squares of blue, 7-inch squares of blue, 7-inch squares of red, and 7-inch strips of whatever you're putting on your side triangle. So let's deal with our squares first. I have 2 blue and 2 red squares, and they're a different red than the one in my sample, but they still work the same. I'm going to stack them where they're right on top of each other and cut 2 at a time. Whatever you're comfortable cutting, you can stack that many. So if you're comfortable cutting 4, you can stack all 4, but here's the catch. If you make a mistake, you make 4 mistakes. So do keep that in mind if you decide to stack. So I'm looking for 2 lines on my tool. Let me move the squares out of the way so you can see. The first line I'm going to line up is the center beam trim number 1 line. It's the dashed line, and I have highlighted it in blue. That's just so I can find that black dashed line. I'm going to line up on the black line, the dashed line, and line that up on the side of my square. And find my rotary cutter, and I'm going to cut right on that line. Tony's over there laughing. Do I have something I need to answer? She's laughing at me. So I'm going to take my tool up and get rid of those 2 triangles. Now, if you want to save these, there are things you can do with this, but I'm not going to deal with those today. I'm just going to lay them aside. So there's where I cut away what was underneath this part of my ruler. And I'm just going to pick this up and twist it until my center beam trim number 2 line lines up with the edge that I just cut. And I'm going to cut again. So I've got 2 red. I just don't know my own strength. Okay, let me push a little harder. I've got 2 red corner beam centers cut. So here's some more triangles that I'm not going to need. I'm going to do the same thing with the blue ones. I'm going to flip it upside down just so you can see a little better what I'm lining up with. And since there's not a right and a left, there's not a directionality of this corner beam unit, it doesn't matter whether I cut this square face up or face down. So I just happen to have one face up and one face down. If you cut squares off of a bolt of fabric, you're going to actually have one face down and one face up like this, but they would be back to back. Then I'm going to twist to the center beam number 2 line, and I'm going to line that up, and I'm going to cut again. So I've got 2 waist triangles from both sides, so I can get rid of those. I'm not going to use them for this block. So I've got my 2 centers of blue and 2 centers of red, and I'm just going to stick it back on my plate. Now here is my strip that I'm going to cut the side triangles that I'm going to replace on that square. Now on these, you have to have a mirror image. So you're going to need to keep your strip either folded, or you're going to have 2 strips, and you're going to place them face to face or back to back. And the way it comes off the bolt is back to back. I'm just going to leave them like that so I can cut a pair of my side triangles at the same time. Now this time I'm not lining up with that dashed line. I'm going to go all the way to the bold solid line. It says it's side triangle trim number 1. And I did not highlight that, but you could if you wanted to, if you need to. And I'm going to cut, and then I'm going to go ahead and lay these out the way they would look. So I'm going to open this up and put the right and the left triangle, side triangle replacement triangles on there. Now this time I'm going to twist all the way around till I find the little bold line that says second trim. I also find that line that says side triangle trim number 2, and I'm going to put that second trim, that bold line goes on the base of my strip, and the side triangle trim number 2 line goes on the edge that I just cut, and I'm going to make my second cut. And I've got another pair, so I'm going to go ahead and split it so you can see that as you cut, you can go ahead and organize your pieces. Again, I'm lining up with a bold, solid line. And as a general rule, you're going to be lining up with whatever your size number is. This says 6-inch finished unit. That's actually what's going to end up on the bottom of my strip because that's my size. I'm lining up on the bold, solid line, side triangle trim number 1, and I make a cut and split it and stack it. And they've kind of got a fold in them, but it'll still be fine. And I'm going to twist around until I get to the long diagonal side triangle trim number 2. Can you see how much easier that is if you've got that highlighted to find that line? It only took me 10 years to figure that out. I would twist and twist and twist until I found the right line, and I could find it, but it's just so much easier to have those lines marked. So now I'm ready to stitch. So I'm going back to the needle, and this is the way my plate looks. Let me get this down where you can see it. It's a little bit of a challenge as big as this is for you to see the whole thing. But when I place this, let me flip this over so you can see. I need my right and left triangles laying here where it looks like it can end up being a square when I stitch those on. If you get your pieces backwards like this, they will fit and you can sew them, but you will never be able to cut them into the corner beam square that you need. So make sure when you lay this out, just to organize yourself, it looks like the square with a beam across corner to corner on your unit. So I like to put this center beam on top as it goes through my needle. So I'll back up here so you can see. I'm going to put this corner beam on top, and I'm just going to basically center it along the side of that long side. There's going to end up being a little ear sticking out here at the bottom, and it's going to stick out a little bit at the top, which is the way I want it. And just kind of center it on there. And this is a perfect time to get yourself in the habit of using a fabric tag, because if your machine tends to want to eat the points of triangles as they go through, this is going to be the time it's going to grab that point and suck it down into your bobbin area, which is going to annoy you. So you want to sew off of your fabric tag, and I'm just aligning that long edge as I go and feed it through. And I'm just stitching. And like I said, you have 11 size options that you could make this. You could actually make these in 3-inch finished units and put 4 of these together to build your block. So you don't have to do the 12-inch block with 4 6-inch units. You could use 3-inch units and put 4 together 4 times. So you have options. And we're going to line that up and stitch right along the edge. And I'm going to do that with all 4 of my corner beam center units. My 2 blue ones and 2 red ones. And of course you can do whatever color you want. I was going to make one that had background in the corner beam and a color on the side triangle, but I didn't cut one of those. But you could also do it that way, and I think you'll find if you look at the instructions, the pattern that you download from Studio 180 Design, they have some that are colored that way, where the background is actually the center beam and the side triangle is the color. And it creates a really cool look. There's several really fun patterns that the Studio 180 Design company has put together. I have a couple of patterns that use this tool, so you're not stuck just doing this searchlight block. Although it's a fun little block, and you can make lots of really neat scrap quilts just using this one unit. See, it's even wanting to eat the point, and I've even got assembly line sewing going. When you do assembly line, then that kind of takes the place of having to have a fabric tag every time you start a unit. And when I get to the end, then I can stop, grab my fabric tag, and park my needle. Now this time, if you want to, you can get up and go to ironing board and press these with your iron. I'm just going to finger press because I want to show you what you do. And I'm going to press toward my side triangle. Now you want to be extremely careful when you're finger pressing this, because I have stitched a bias edge of background and my corner beam. So this whole seam is a bias edge, but also this side is a bias edge. So I want to be careful when I'm finger pressing. I don't want to get real heavy-handed so that I stretch this side out, because then I'm going to be real unhappy. Now at this point, I'm going to put this side triangle on. I can flip it over just like this, and I'm just going to kind of center that along the seam, and it's going to have a little bit of an ear sticking out on the top and the bottom. And I'm just going to start stitching, and I'm aligning along this long side. You don't want to be tugging and pulling on your fabric because of that bias edge that you're stitching. So let the machine do the work, pulling it through. If your machine is not pulling that through and sewing it evenly, you may need to have your machine worked on, because that's going to give you a more true square without any distortion. if you let the machine do the work. I can see that there's comments, but I can't read them because I've got one strength of glasses on and a different strength that I need to see across there. So we've got a couple of people that watch regularly from Florida and one from Georgia and one from Arizona sometimes, and a bunch that are local, which is nice. So I'm just lining up along this long side. I'm not going to take the time to sew the other side of the blue ones because I want to have time to trim them and show you a couple of things that you could do with them. So when you get to the other side, now you're ready to take them to the iron and actually let the iron do the work. I'm having a hard time finding the thread that I'm supposed to be cutting. And so I've got 2 units completed, and I'm going to the overhead camera so you can see what you do next. For many of you, this is review. You've done corner beam units before because if you've watched any of our past series, I have used corner beam every time. It's a really cool unit that if you're not doing this manner, it is a challenge to get those seams to line up the way you want them to and to have the right amount of seam allowance for the next seam that goes across there. So I have finger pressed just to kind of get the seams headed in the right direction. And I'm just going to let the iron sit there for a minute while I get my fabric pressing pin and put just a quick little strip of the fabric solution and let the iron do the work. And then I'm going to do the same thing with this one. And I often stack up my units as I'm pressing. That gives them just a little bit more time underneath the iron. And I typically stack up 5 or 6 at a time and then I start a new stack. And notice I'm letting it sit on the point longer than I am back here because the point is the part, if you're going to have anything that's not going to lay down flat, it would be this point where all of the seams come together. So I've got my 2 units. I'm going to move my pressing mat out of the way. And let's talk about how you would trim this. So notice that these 2 seam placement lines run parallel to the 2 seam lines. Those 2 placement lines are going to line up on these 2 seams. If you're right-handed, you're going to point your corner beam pointy end to the top right corner, and you're going to line up your 2 seam placement lines on those 2 seams, and it comes together to form an X right at the intersection where the tip of that point belongs. So once you get those in place, I got to move a little bit so I can see. Then you're ready to trim, and we're going to trim up and over. Get rid of those 2 little pieces. Then I'm going to turn 180 degrees. This time, the little mark down here that says 6, and it's a point, that's going on the tip of my unit. And I'm going to tweak that till it lines up where I want it to. A couple of other things to look for. Looks like I needed to trim just a little more off the tip. Let me go back and with the camera where it is and the light where it is, and I did not see clearly where I needed to be placing it. So sometimes you have to give it another little tiny trim. So the 6-inch point goes on the tip. And then you want to tweak this until the 6.5-inch line goes on your cut edges. When I get that in place, I just wiggled it. There's a couple of little tiny slash marks here at the back end of my corner beam unit so I can tell if I've got it on there straight. And you want to kind of check all of those places so that when you trim, it'll line up as a true square. Your seams will end up where you need them to be so that this seam would go across in the exact center of that 6.5-inch span when you put another block next to it. So for instance, if I was putting a 4 patch there, I would want to make sure that that seam lines up exactly on that seam. And that's what the tool does for you. So if you are left-handed, all you have to do is point your point to the left, turn your tool so that those two diagonal seam lines line up parallel to the left, and then you're ready to trim. I'm not left-handed, so I'm not going to try that. I'm going to go back to this way, and I'm going to line up. I'm going to get that trimmed up over, and then I'm going to turn 180 degrees, and I just move my excess away. You want to put the number 6, whatever your finished size, on that tip and line up. Make sure your little slash marks are parallel to those seams. And now I've got 2 red units, so I'm going to put this back over here so you can see it. So I can put my red units here. I can put my blue ones points in, my red ones points out, like that. I could put my blue ones points out. However you want to put them together, that's perfectly fine. You can also make some interesting blocks. This would not be a 12-inch block, but you could actually split this and put a little sash here and a little stone here and create a really cool little block that way. So there's lots of different things you can do. Now, when I was cutting the first time, I wasn't paying attention to how big this needed to be. So I cut a 5-inch square and a 5-inch strip. And of course, that would not have ended up being a 6-inch finished unit. So I just trimmed it down and I made 2-inch units. And I put together some blocks no, this is actually a 3-inch finished unit because once you stitch this in. So I just made several blocks using that measurement. I have stuck them up on the wall, and you may have noticed them behind me. But notice if I had a 4th one, that would create a neat little star in the middle and a red ring around it. So you have lots of options. You could actually make units that are 3-inch finished, put them together in sets of 4, and when you put 3 or 4 of those together, that would also be a 12-inch block. So you have options for what you actually stitch together. You don't have to stick with the size that is makes just a 12-inch block with just 4 of the corner beam units. You could make other sizes and play with it and get all sorts of different looks for that. So, any questions? Oh, good. Elaine's going to make a bunch of these. And I like them. They're a lot of fun. There are going to be more of the corner beam units going forward, so we'll be reviewing that again. But I can't stress enough, if it helps you to mark your tools, it makes it a whole lot easier to find the lines you need to find quickly, especially if, like Elaine, you're going to make a bunch of these. You don't want to have to hunt for those lines every time that you get your tool out. And the more you make them, the easier it will get. So that'll make it nice too. So after I close, I'll post this on YouTube. You can watch it there again or tell your friends. If you don't have your corner beam tool yet, contact us because we carry all the tools and all the technique sheets. Next week we'll be using a technique sheet that the sliver technique sheet. So if you don't have that, you might want to get it before then, and we do have that. So give us a call and we can send it to you, or come by and get it so that you'll be prepared for next week. So until next week, happy sewing. We'll see you next week live at 5.